Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the National Alliance for Safe Housing's webinar titled Rapid Rehousing with Survivors, A Tale of Two Programs. My name is Chris Billhart. I'm Nash's Director of Program and Practice Innovation, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. I'm joined by Christy Beavis from the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, who will be helping with behind-the-scenes stuff, as well as watching the chat box with us. We're very excited to be able to spotlight two amazing programs and just have a small amount of light housekeeping to go over before we get started. First, you'll notice that all webinar participants have been placed on mute today. If you're having tech issues and need assistance or would like to ask a question, as Anna indicated, please enter it into the chat box. We'll be fielding some of the questions that come up on the chat box by using the chat box, but we will be saving many of the questions that we receive for the Q&A at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar will run for a little over an hour, after which we'll spend 20 to 30 minutes on the Q&A session. We'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible, but if we're not able to answer something for you, please follow up with us after the webinar. We'll email contact information out after the webinar, along with a recording of the presentation and a link to an evaluation. You can also request a certificate of completion through the evaluation if you should want one. In just a few moments, it'll be my pleasure to welcome Genese Jones-Torrence, who serves as Vice President of Crisis Services for SafeNest in Las Vegas, Nevada, and Harper Guerrero, the Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer for Emerge, Center for Domestic Abuse in Tucson, Arizona. But first, I'd like to provide some brief information about Nash, go over our objectives for today, and lay out some foundational information for our focus on rapid rehousing. So Nash's mission, you can see there on the slide, really what our aim is to help communities work towards increasing the housing options that are available to survivors. And we do this in many ways, helping communities better align services across systems and communication, development and enhancement of effective approaches, discovery of effective approaches, and bringing in tools and information that can support communities' efforts. We also love to be able to connect people who are working in the same realms and can share and be resources for one another, which is a big part of what we're doing here today. Nash and NRCDV are both part of the DV and Housing TA Consortium. And it's a really exciting and kind of an unprecedented broad collaboration that involves 4 federal agencies who are supporting the work that we're doing together, and 5 national technical assistance providers, which you can see listed on the screen. I think this is really indicative of the importance with which these federal agencies and providers and communities around the country are taking the look at the intersection between domestic and sexual violence and homelessness and housing instability. So we're 5 technical assistance providers that are kind of fanning out across the country to really try to provide a breadth of services and support for communities. So here briefly are our objectives for today. We're going to quickly define rapid rehousing and outline some of the necessary modifications for when we use it with survivors. We're obviously, the feature presentation of today is the spotlight of 2 domestic violence programs that have successfully incorporated rapid rehousing. We're also going to weave in an examination of racial disparities in housing, and we've asked these programs to describe how they're addressing them. So what is rapid rehousing? I'm not sure if there's anyone on the call who has not seen this definition, but it's an intervention designed to help people quickly exit homelessness and return to permanent housing. The intent is to really help people avoid long shelter stays, which can be very destabilizing, or in some cases avoid shelter altogether when all the stars align. So getting people back into a neighborhood setting and out of facilities or substandard living conditions as soon as possible. Now, when we look across programs and approaches that are responding to survivors' housing needs effectively, we see some commonalities, and these are some of the things that they tend to feature. Flexible programming and flexible financial assistance, mobile advocacy, the ability to reach out and meet with survivors in settings other than shelters and program offices, to be able to be out in the ground with them and making community connections. We also see low barrier, minimal program eligibility requirements, and the services tend to be very much focused on a commitment to being survivor-driven, where survivors are basically describing what their needs are and what kind of help they would like to get. These services are also trauma-informed and culturally responsive and voluntary, so moving away from requirements and mandatory expectations. We also see flexible duration for those needing longer-term support rather than a really strict adherence to X number of months of rent assistance, for example. It's much more fluid based on the needs of the family or the survivor. And also really a focus on supporting survivors to reconnect with the community, which is a huge part of really establishing stabilization and safety. When using an intersectional lens in our housing programs and service deliveries is really critical. So anytime we're talking about designing a program, designing an approach to doing the work, this intersectional lens is hugely important to undergird all those efforts. There are huge racial disparities when we look at rates of homelessness across populations. And I'm sure that many of you have heard of the SPARK study, which came from the Center for Social Innovation. Came out just a few years ago, and they did an intense examination of a lot of data as well as talking with people, and found very, very high rates of homelessness that are well beyond the representation of these different racial groups in the general population. And you can see some of that data there. We also really had help through this study to look at not how poverty is not the explaining factor in why communities of color are showing higher rates of homelessness. There is an aspect that the researchers found that they called network impoverishment, which is really basically not just the individual or household is impoverished or without connections or opportunities, but the entire community that they might be reaching out to is experiencing an impoverished state. So if you're at the end of the month and the rent's coming due and you need that $100 to make the rent, and you call Aunt Betty and Aunt Betty doesn't have that money either, then that networking that can keep a lot of people out of homelessness is just not available to folks. So that's something that we're, as I said, asking our presenters to address today, how they're building in attention to intersectionality in their programming. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Genese Jones-Torrence, who's going to tell us about Operation Freshstart.
Hello, thank you so much, Chris. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for attending and participating with us today. My name is Genese Jones-Torrence, VP of Crisis Services with SafeNest in Las Vegas, Nevada. I entered this space today not just as your facilitator, but I come to this role as an educator and advocate and activist in this work, and also as a child survivor of domestic violence. My mother is a survivor of domestic violence, even if you may ask her today, she does not agree with that. and I don't, subscribe that to her, and also as a survivor of multiple forms of abuse. And I say that because my alignment with trauma-informed care and leadership is not just ethical practice for me, but it is also a standard for how I live my life. And I lead that because I want to encourage all of you on this call to look at trauma-informed care and practice as more than just a theoretical practice, but as a way that we have to look at this work in terms of what is going on nationally, in terms of the experiences of the people that we serve, in terms of the criminalization of immigration that many of our population is experiencing, in terms of the historical oppression and trauma that communities of color have experienced, and that trauma is experienced in those forms as well. So trauma is not just the physical and emotional forms of intimate partner violence that we are accustomed to. It is all of those different structures that Chris just spoke to. I am from an organization called SafeNest, and we are the oldest, largest, most comprehensive domestic violence agency in the state of Nevada. And like so many of the agencies that you all represent, we have a 24-hour crisis hotline and provide protection orders and emergency shelter. We have counseling programs, court advocacy, therapy, and many of the programs that a lot of the domestic violence agencies across the nation provide. I have had the honor of being with this agency since 2005, and I have been in this role since 2018. And so when I came into this role, I came into this space with the knowledge of direct services and, thought that I was just coming over to shelter and we were just going to save everyone and, having this really naive role of what shelter was, what it represented, and also the staff. And so I'm just going to be really frank with you. I want to be candid with you. I want to share our successes, our challenges, and what we have gone through over the last 18 months or so in building a housing-first perspective and bringing rapid rehousing to our clientele, because that is what these survivors have asked for. When initially, so traditionally, when you entered shelter, and I entitled this particular slide #ShelterLife, because that is what my staff says. When, you have traditional shelter entry, and we have this catalog of services, right? So there is the traditional emergency shelter for those that are fleeing shelter. We safety plan, we provide respite, we provide our basic needs. There is life skills education for those that are processing and staying longer and that are going through their healing. We have our empowerment-based advocacy. And then what? And that's what I posed to my staff when I first started. Okay, where are the ladies going? Where are the people that we're helping? What happens after shelter? And resoundingly, I kind of got the answer, well, we don't know. That's not in our wheelhouse. And we had to ask ourselves, is that acceptable? And if we are not the ones who are answering that question, then who answers that? And so that led us to say, what happens after shelter? And who are we? And are we supporting our mission, which is to help our residents move from crisis to confidence? And so what we did as a team is we held up the mirror and we said, who are we? What practices are we implementing and are we putting in place that support that goal? And what are we doing that don't support that goal? And I think that many of us over the past 5 to 10 years have adopted a more trauma-informed lens. We have went from less restrictive rules and less punitive rules to more guidelines, and that's exactly what we did. So a lot of the practice that supported the goals to help survivors move to confidence was the safety through the emergency shelter. So we knew that we wanted to keep emergency shelter. That is definitely something in our field that needed to stay. Empowerment-based advocacy was working. So that was being survivor-centered, right, being trauma-informed, and also providing access to outside agencies. That was something that we were already doing. Safety planning and the initial assessment, that's something that we were already doing, and providing comprehensive safety planning, and also providing those assistance, obtaining vital docs, and helping survivors with the starting on the path to their new life, because I don't know what a lot of you in your jurisdictions may be facing, but our population, what we are finding here is that in Las Vegas, we are a very transient town. So, of course we have our local population, but there is a lot of our population who are brought here from other places. And so abusers will bring a survivor here, or bring a victim here, and they don't have anyone else. And, of course, abusers sabotage. They are taking paperwork, and they are doing all of those things that we've seen in coercive control. And so we've got to help them from ground zero. And so we are aware of that. But, again, I'm going to be honest with you, there were some practices in line that did not support our goal. There was an abundance of involuntary exits. And what do I mean by that? Someone has a trauma response, right? They get loud. They have an outburst, and you've got to go, right? So we're exiting people. There were limited flexible funds available. So maybe someone needed assistance with their gas money. Maybe they needed assistance with education, and at that point, it may not have been readily available. At that time, our advocacy did not focus on housing. We would refer out, and it was a referral, but there was not the mobile crisis advocacy attached to that. And there was also a lack of understanding of the role of emergency DV shelters. And what I mean by that is my belief is that once a victim reaches out to us, it is incumbent upon us as victim service providers to provide the resources, right? We need to be that one-stop shop. And I've heard it explained in a multitude of ways across different industries. The no wrong door approach, the intersectional approach, right, where we are working with sexual assault providers, we are working with human trafficking, but once the survivor is here, that we are meeting their needs. And we didn't necessarily see it like that at that point. And we also were not communicating with our residents. And again, we just had to be honest about who we were and who we wanted to be. And so we started from scratch, and we started over, and we redefined who we were. And there was a shift. There was a shift. We adopted a truly trauma-informed, survivor-centered lens. Who are we serving? What help are they asking for? What happened to her? What happened to him? Who is standing in front of us? Who is our population? So speaking to some of the disparities, some of the realities of our population, of the people that we serve, of the traumas, of the realities of life that survivors go through, our population is predominantly women of color, 78% to be exact. In shelter, 43% of the women in our 71-bed shelter are black women. 25% identify as Hispanic women. 9% is multiracial women. Of that, 12% are immigrant women. This is the reality of the women that we serve. How are our practices? How are our programming? How are our relationships out in the community serving these women, and how are we meeting their needs? So we had to review all of our current rules, and again, shifting to guidelines. One of my go-to manuals was and forgive me if I misspeak it, was it the earth didn't fly into the sun? I love that. And I would leave it on everyone's desk, right, and send it in an electronic copy. I wanted them to know, hey, Ms. Genese is not making this up, right? This is something in our field. And slowly but surely, it became a best practice amongst our staff. It became a cultural shift. It became something that we all bought into. We started more formal collaboration. So, of course, we're all working together, and we all know what the partners are in the community. But a MOU holds a certain accountability. You know, sitting down at the table and formalizing it, again, it holds a certain accountability. Joining task forces, again, I think it makes people stand up, you know, and so we showed up in a different way. And then we also had staff development in those new concepts and best practices. One of the things that we hold ourselves very, very proud here at SafeNest is that we have had such an abundance of staff that has a long tenure. And with that comes a vast array of knowledge. But one of the things that our field is so proud of is that our trends are changing, and we have more evidence-based practice, and there is so much knowledge that has come in the last few years. And so we, as leaders, have to also make sure that our staff are continuously educating themselves and are also up to date on best practices. An intersectional lens also needs to be adopted, I believe. It is a way that I have always tried to view things, and our leadership team, which consists of 5 managers over at Shelter. I will show you our breakdown, our organizational chart over there. But this is the way we explain intersectionality to our team. So this is just a diagram. So the way I explain it to my team, and I think you guys can see my pointer, I don't know, but domestic violence, that's the only assumption that we should have about the women or the men that we are serving. That's the only thing that we know about the people that we're serving, is that they have experienced some type of domestic abuse, intimate partner violence in their lives. But they have a whole bunch of other components to their person, to their individuality, that are equally as important, that need to be considered. And from religion to their immigration status to the language, culture, gender, age, ability, occupation, meaning, and I pose this question to my staff, are you going to treat a stripper, a sex worker, the same way that you are going to treat the clergy? And I hope that answer is yes, right? From race to income to sexual orientation. And as we start having the housing conversation, we realize that all of those things affect their housing status. And in what way do we ask? From bias, from an ability to obtain a job, from different intersections with violence, with community violence, with access to services in the community. Safe Housing Partnerships has been a go-to for me, and one of the infographics that I use to explain the intersection of homelessness and domestic violence explains that as many as 57% of all homeless women report DV as the immediate cause of their homelessness. That is not to say that domestic violence is not, domestic violence causes homelessness, and then there is domestic violence experienced in homelessness, right? So there is a couple of different conversations that we can have about the way that this is experienced, and I hope I'm making sense with that. But it's a conversation. And one of the slides I didn't include it in this presentation that I like to use, it's a quote from the late, great Audre Lorde, is that there is no single issue cause, is because we do not live single issue lives. And again, I would beckon you, with every single life that you touch, in every single person that you touch, to consider that, is that there's a complexity of experiences and identities that we each encompass, and to not lose sight of that. So we had to add housing advocacy to this, because survivors, again, were asking. Survivors and residents at shelter were staying longer. And so we had our shelter entry and our shelter services, and we added advocacy services, and they were always a part. So I don't want to misrepresent that we did not have a housing advocate. There was a housing advocate at shelter, but it was not a major role. She was there if you needed her. She was there if you wanted to access her. It was not something that was brought to the forefront in the beginning. We did not have a DV housing first approach. And also, we had a very short stay. We had a 30-day emergency respite period, and that's kind of how we presented it. And so what we realized is that the 30 days was not enough for most people. And so we had to package it a little bit different. And so we extended our shelter stay. We made housing and DV first a main component of the shelter intake in asking, are you interested in housing? Do you need housing, access to housing services? We were already a part of the COC. They have been so instrumental in guiding us in being an access point for housing services for our population. And so we just built off of that current relationship. So this is what we did. This is our organizational structure over at the shelter now. So you got me, and then this is my team. My leadership team consists of 5 managers, 4 managers and my therapist, my counselor. And instead of just having the housing advocate, we promoted that position to a manager because that particular advocate, her name is Sylvia Davis. I'm going to shout her out by name because she is awesome. Very knowledgeable. And again, leaders out there, when you have staff that know their stuff, like honor them, promote them and utilize them. And I wanted to hold on to her. And I was like, you know what, we're gonna elevate her. We're gonna utilize the skill set. We knew that we had new funding for this rapid rehousing program coming. And so we had this manager position, which allowed me to have the advocate position. And so housing now has its own branch. And so that elevated housing and put it into the forefront and allowed it to have its own driver, so to speak. And preparation is everything. And so we were slated for a November 2018 launch. And so in the meantime, I had to get full agency support, right? So between all of leadership, we had to gain our CEO support and our COO support, right? Our chief operating officer goes after the grants to support our efforts. So if they're not in line, how are we going to sustain our program? And I don't mean the buy-in in terms of, oh, yeah, they know that the funding opportunities are out there, and so when they see them, they will go after them. No, I mean someone who is really going to champion for you, and they are going to seek these opportunities, that they are going to actively collaborate with other organizations on your behalf, that they are going to listen to survivor voices, and they are going to be advocates in their own right. And so that is what we have with our COO. We've secured those rapid rehousing funds, through our Southern Nevada Homelessness COC, which again, like I said, has been such a guiding force for us. Operation Freshstart is born. We've gotten full agency support. The shelter staff shift toward integrating our DV Housing First principles, as I said, along with that staff development. There was pushback. I've had, some staff who said we're not homeless services, we're domestic violence. And, again, my pushback is if there's a domestic violence victim who is homeless, who is supposed to help? If they are asking us for help, who else, So, again, one of my sayings, and you'll see it at the end of the presentation, when you don't have the resource, you become the resource. That's one of my sayings. The accounting department is in line. Why the accounting department? When you need those rent checks, you want to be able to make a phone call and get it that day, right? When you need flex funding, you want to have someone who's not going to hold you up, So you want to have a friend over there. You need your board engagement. So if you have some outlandish ideas, you might have someone over there who can be a champion for you as well. And then all staff and volunteers. And I can happily say that we have that now. It took a while, but we have that, and it has made all the difference in making this a successful program. We've defined our roles. The housing manager and the advocate have clearly defined roles. And so we had to identify the available housing units in the community for the manager. So essentially, the manager knocks them up or sets them up, the advocate knocks them down. That's how I explain it. Manager goes out there, builds the relationships with the landlord, finds the available units, orders any of the inspections that are needed. The acronyms that are there for those of you that are not familiar with that is the housing quality standards, the environmental review. Those are some of the HUD inspections that are out there. Again, they work with the landlord and the property managers. They mediate as needed between the participants and the landlords. She's finding that she's having to do that less and less. But, in mobile crisis advocacy, we will do what we need to do. We truly have had to step up and do what we need to do, and Sylvia is amazing at that. And then she also manages the financial assistance, the request, and the distribution. The advocate, her role has been to provide that survivor center mobile advocacy, so she's really the one that's out there providing the case management, for lack of a better word. I don't like that word in advocacy. It's just a personal thing. She identifies the current shelter residents eligible for participation OFS. She really does a lot of the rapport building, the relationship building here on site, and she assists the survivors as they transition to the permanent housing. Teamwork makes the dream work. They can't do it alone. They cannot do it alone. The shelter advocates have to be involved in this process because, again, in our particular program, and I know it's going to be different for all of you out there, but our particular program, the pipeline, the pathway to our program is through shelter. So our shelter advocates, that's the active engagement. Those are the advocates who actually present the housing options to the residents. They are building hope, as we say. Our check-ins are weekly hopes. And we also have a vision of confidence. That's what we call our plan of action, is the vision of confidence. What do you see for the future? What are your plans? And in our DV Housing First model, we try to have an action plan or the vision of confidence within 7 days, and not in a mandatory way. Again, this is all voluntary, survivor-driven, but it's how you ask the question. What do you see for yourself? In a perfect world, what a confident future look like for you? That tells you what the long-term goal is for someone. And this is a side conversation. It might even be another webinar, you guys. But it also brings up documentation and things like that for agencies and program building. What type of information are we keeping and what type of programs are we building for residents? So, again, side conversation. But this is how we make it work. So our advocates start the conversation, and then it moves to our manager, and then our housing advocate is the one who maintains that longer-term relationship after they start the program. Operation Freshstart is our rapid rehousing program. Again, as I explained to you all, it launched in 2018, November, so still has not completed the first year. It is a short to mid-term assistance program, up to 12 months of rental assistance. It is a gradually decreasing subsidy. 100% of the rent is paid that first quarter, down to 75, 50, 25% that last quarter, with the thought is that the end of their first year lease, that this person has had a year of active in-home advocacy, supportive services, access to support services at our main office in counseling. Those supportive services are the flexible spending dollars. So education, if there's any food scarcity going on, we will help with that and assist with that. Child care dollars. In that advocacy, we also have our good neighbor, good tenant skill building. That actually begins while they're on site at shelter. And essentially what that is budgeting, financial planning. It is making sure prior to signing the lease, going over the lease with them, making sure that they are processing the language and they understand what the expectations are. If there are any pet fees or clauses, anything like that. If there's any ordinances of noise and things of that nature, tenant rights even, and just using that to build as a guidepost. And this is not in any behavior modification for them, so to speak, but if they ask, we are here. Also, with the knowledge, this has come up. Chris and I had a really good conversation recently about this. With the knowledge, you all, that abuser sabotage is real, with the knowledge that the women, children, men that we serve are human, sometimes that advocacy is knowing that they have reunited. Sometimes that advocacy is safety planning with my staff on how to make sure that they are safe. So I'll talk about that too. I'll touch on some of those things. But this is our program. This is our program. Here's our eligibility for the program, right? So it's HUD Category 4. I'm hoping all of you are familiar with that term. For those of you that have to sign or fill out the HMIS form or the CMIS form. And for us here in Clark County, Nevada, they have to be a current resident of a domestic violence shelter. And just for a side note and for a frame of reference, I would like you all to know that here in our particular county, which serves a population of 2.2 million people, there are two, count them, two DV agencies. A total, I think, of 105 beds. Okay, here are some of the steps to permanent housing. Okay, as I said, they meet our advocate. They go through their weekly hope or their vision of confidence. They get their referral. They are put into the coordinated entry queue. The advocate identifies their housing options through the landlord list. They ensure that an active environmental review is on each property. They then assist the resident in the permanent inspection. And once approved by the landlord, we assist with all the required fees. And then there's a move-in. I would be remiss if I said that it happened as quickly as I just went through that list. Sometimes there is a wait, but again, that's where good advocacy comes in. Checking in, making sure that we are there for emotional support when a crisis response or a trauma response comes in. You know, am I going to really get this place? You know, is the abuser there trying to sabotage or emotionally abusing in the background? You know, you're not going to get this place. You know, those people aren't going to help you. You're never going to make it. You know, is the advocate there checking in with them, helping them, you know, so that they can stay patient or they can stay focused, you know, reminding them that they're safe in this moment, they're still at shelter, or if they've entered another program, if they're in bridge housing, whatever the case may be, because we're all different. But again, that's where good advocacy comes in as you're awaiting. Our program, we couldn't do this on our own. It is very much dependent on our relationship with the landlords, very much on the workforce training. And that is because, again, we are rapid rehousing and we are helping with the rental subsidy, but the end goal is independence, correct? and we know that that can lend to reduced vulnerability. And so we do try to, and not try, we have linked to Goodwill and One Stop and a lot of the different employment services here. Also community-based organizations and our coordinated, or our COC, excuse me, because our COC is full of other organizations that we refer to. And then again, those supportive services, as I explained. What we can celebrate, because we can celebrate, and I'm so excited. So if you hear the passion in my voice, it is so genuine. 26 households have been placed since November 2018. That's 73 individuals. We have fostered so many relationships in the community. Again, organizations, landlords, property managers. Our property list is still a work in progress, and that is never going to change. So those of you that are working, just know that it's always going to be a work in progress. We've placed another additional 22 families also through coordinated entry. And just as a side note, our program is also reflective of the racial disparities and also of the needs of our community. 88% of our participants in OFS are women of color. And I'm going to jam through this because you guys, anyone that knows me, you guys know I can get long-winded. So here are some of the things that we faced, you guys. Resident approval, and you guys know this, due to sabotage, due to evictions, credit history, even with things with the guarantee of rent, landlords still want to see the 2 times rent. I came in this, as I said, naive. I thought people just wanted to do the right thing. I thought they were going to hear that SafeNest was supporting DV survivors and they were going to want in on this. You guys, that is not the truth. That's not what's going on. There are a lot of people out there that see victims as nuisance tenants. They don't want that on their property. Just last week, we heard someone say, I don't want a property full of people with issues. Oh, wow. He doesn't know that that's against the law, so we'll be, advocating in another space, but that's another, conversation. We have a lot of survivors with pets, right, and they will not leave without their fur babies. We have racial bias. We have mental health bias, substance abuse, some unexpected expenses, those past evictions, things on the credit history that the victim, the survivor, may not have even known was there. So many things that can pop up that we may not know and that your funds may actually not even pay for. They may not cover that. And so if you have other funds, please see if you can cover those. So flexible funds, not just from your rapid rehousing funds, but VOCA funds, any other private fundings that you may have. And then realize that there may be participants that become unemployed soon after securing because of trauma response, because of life, because of disparities, because of sabotage. They may have another incident of domestic violence. And I believe, and please, Chris, in the chat box, if you can let folks know, I think we are all covered under HUD and VAWA housing protections. So if someone experiences DV under our watch, they are eligible for a transfer. All right, we've already talked about this, so I won't go into detail. One of the things, you guys, that has been really successful is that we've joined the Rapid Rehousing Learning Collaborative, and so if you have the opportunity to do that out there, I would encourage you to do that. It is really, really helpful to talk amongst your peers. And for those of us that are new to this, it's a learning experience. From here, you guys, what I want to close with is that housing is sales. Sylvia wanted me to tell all of you that are out there, housing is sales. Learn how to package this in a way, for one, everyone does not have to know that we are representing victims of violence. Not everyone has a bleeding heart for DV victims. We have to just accept that. Social responsibility sometimes will work, but at the end of the day, money, money, money. Can we pay double security deposits? Can we offer things like that? Can we talk about social investment? And there's also a benefit to have a mediator, not someone who speaks on their behalf, because of course we want to talk about empowerment, but having a manager or an advocate who is definitely involved. And then I talked about just practice. This is still new for us, so just learning what is the correct timeline for assistance. You know, we're learning here. We're learning. And then here we are looking toward the future, you guys. In terms of self-sufficiency, what I meant by that is that self-sufficiency to us meant, okay, this person is going to live on their own. Do we ever truly live on our own? Chris, you pointed out in your slides, we want to encourage reaching out to the community. Okay, we want to encourage leaning on family supports and those things. So really defining the goal of self-sufficiency. What we really want is safety. What we really want is independence, and that is what lessens vulnerability and what is in the end going to lend to, just lessening domestic violence. So I am on my time, you all. My final thought, housing is safety and is a major protective factor for survivors of domestic violence experiencing homelessness. I know a lot of folks do not agree with that, but my pushback on that is for a lot of folks it is empowering. People need their own space. They need a place to call their own. Those of us in DV agencies are being called to offer comprehensive services that meet the very needs of the people we serve. When we cannot find the resources out in the community, we have to become the resource. Thank you so much, you all, for giving me this opportunity and for taking the time to listen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Genese. That was wonderful. And lots of questions came in. So we're going to move forward and hear from Ana Harper Guerrero about the Emerge program, and we'll then move to the questions at the end of her talk. Ana?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Genese, for your presentation and all of the great work that you all are doing. I'm truly honored to also have this opportunity to share our work with you all. So my name is Ana Harper Guerrero, and I'm the Executive Vice President here at Emerge. I've been with Emerge for about 11 years, and I started my time at the organization as the shelter manager. I'm born and raised in this community, and I've spent somewhere around 20-ish years total supporting survivors of domestic abuse and sexual violence in our community. And I share this because what that's meant for me is that I've seen an entire evolution of services happen in our community, and I've had the privilege to grow and change with that as well. And so the story I'm going to share with you about our agency and program is really a reflection of that evolution. So a little bit about Emerge. We're located in Tucson, Arizona. We are the only provider in this community. So we are a large organization. We have a total of 99 staff positions. And right now, we're running on about 71 of those positions being filled. So we have some vacancies that absolutely impact the way that things go on a day-to-day basis. Emerge is the product of a merger that happened between two long-standing organizations in this community that happened in 2008. And so we offer a full continuum of services that I'm going to share a little more about in a minute. We're very close to the border. We're about 45 minutes from the Mexico border. We have a large population of monolingual Spanish-speaking families in our community who also have immigration issues intersecting the abuse and violence that they're experiencing. We also have a large population of refugee communities in Pima County, and so there are several resettlement organizations that we work with. The other thing that's important to know about the geographical context and makeup of our community is that we are in close proximity to the Tohono-O'odham Nation, which crosses the U.S.-Mexico border, and in total that reservation is about the size of Connecticut. And so this context is important for some of the points that I'm going to make later about the way that our program operates. The other thing that I want to share just in terms of history is that prior to 2011, Emerge had two shelters. We had a 51-bed facility and a 70-bed facility. Around 2011, after just sort of watching the patterns of how people came in and out of shelter, what their needs truly were, and just realizing that shelter had become the housing option for people who were homeless as a result of domestic abuse, we made a pretty courageous decision to close the 71-bed facility and reallocate the funds for that program into a housing program. And so now we just have the one facility and some overflow that I'll talk about in a minute. I want to give a little more information about the full scope of Emerge. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but just so that everyone has information about the entire agency. As I said, we're a large system, so we have a 24-hour hotline, multilingual hotline, where we provide the basic services that most hotlines provide in terms of emotional support, crisis counseling, information, and referral. It is the entry point to shelter, so our screening process happens off of our hotline. And it's also the hub for our community's risk assessment protocol. And I'll talk a little bit about what that has meant for us in a minute. Our emergency shelter is called the Reflection Center, and as I said, it's a 51-bed facility that we recently made some changes in the structure of that facility based on the impact of having this county-wide risk assessment protocol. But people can stay for 90 days in our emergency shelter program. And at the end of the 90-day mark, if they're on a path to a housing plan and need some more time to allow that to stabilize, whether that's coming into our housing stabilization program or going into another program in the community, or a third option of just getting it together on their own, we can give them an additional 30 days for the purpose of housing stabilization. And that is really an offshoot of the housing program that we offer and how we've evolved since we rolled out that program to have much more of an umbrella kind of model where folks can get various levels of service and types of help under that model. And so our shelter is really, we've returned it to the original intention of shelter in domestic abuse services, and that is to provide safe, confidential shelter for people who are at the highest risk of reassault or near lethal violence. Everyone else is referred to our community-based programs and or into our housing program. We also offer services to children and families at all of our sites. Our two community-based offices offer support services for people who don't need or want shelter, and that's an entire range of folks who are at the initial stages of considering leaving their relationship to folks who are needing longer-term support in their transition into healing. The other thing that we offer that's based out of our community-based sites, but again is spread throughout all of our services, is a pretty robustly legal program where we do many of the standard things like court accompaniment, preparation, information about victims' rights, referrals to lawyers, etc. We also have a domestic violence court at our Tucson City Court, and we have two advocates who staff that court as well. The other thing that we offer outside of our housing program is a small men's education program that really is an exercise in the intersection of prevention and intervention programming for male-identified individuals who are using violence. So we can intervene with folks who are using violence, but the broader goal is also to focus on building a community of men who are prepared to intervene and help other men be accountable for their violence. And so it's not a battery intervention program. I really resist that model because we don't just take court-ordered men. We're looking at all men in our community. We primarily serve cisgender heterosexual men in that program, and that's not because we don't recognize that other people can be abusive, but it was a decision about the place that we could make the most impact, and so we chose to focus there. And I'm going to, again, most of the presentation will be about our housing stabilization services, so I'm not going to spend time on that right now. But a little more about Emerge. These stats are for fiscal year 2018, just to give you an idea of the volume that comes through. As I said, we have a statewide risk assessment protocol that for us has meant that the volume has increased significantly, and also the types of cases that we're getting. So we're seeing a lot of cases with really significant levels of violence and risk associated with them. We are just in the process of finalizing our service statistics for the fiscal year that just ended, but just to give you an idea of that impact, for total unduplicated program participants, as you can see on the slide, we had about 5,800 in fiscal year 2018, but for fiscal year 2019, we're looking at somewhere around 7,000 unduplicated participants. And the rest of the numbers sort of go up under there. So our framework, and it's going to probably sound like I'm spending a lot of the time talking about programmatic philosophy, and I see a good number of the questions being about mechanics of the program. And many of the points that Genese and Chris already made about philosophy, racial equity, and just sort of the broader concepts of how we think about housing and what that means for domestic abuse survivors, we have the same approach and philosophy. And so what I'll try to do is maybe give some examples of what the implementation of that philosophy looks like in running a housing program. And to be quite frank, what I have found in all of the years that we've been running this program is that the more that we can stay centered in our principles and values with the work, the more success survivors find in meeting their goals, based on what they decide is most helpful and healing for them. And so it's also meant that as an organization, we have to be really critical of the ways that we replicate control dynamics in the lives of the folks that we're trying to serve. And so we often struggle with, the idea of what does it mean for a nonprofit organization that really operates as a system to be a part of liberating communities from violence. And those things can be in conflict many days. So for us, it's about protocols and policies that do not perpetuate patterns of control and that don't punish survivors for the choices that they make in their survival. It's really about not making people prove their worth or credibility to have access to support and assistance, but rather that it's our work to figure out how to ensure that we're giving people the resources that they need to make their lives work in the ways that they've decided they need to work. It's also about being open to understanding and respecting that we all have different ways of living and structuring our households. And so our role is to, before we do anything with a survivor, to understand how they would define what safe housing means to them, who they would like to live with, where they would like to live, and then we use our resources to support their vision. And that doesn't have to just be financial resources. And so, I think that with Emerge being a fairly large mainstream organization, and we also do run like a business administratively, we've had to find a way to build our infrastructure so that rules and control over resources don't become our primary focus, but they're really counterintuitive for the kind of framework that prioritizes helping people to be successful in starting their life over. And I'll talk more about what I mean by that as my piece goes on. So Genese talked a lot about the ways that folks having multiple identities impacts the way that they can experience our program and how they define trust, safety, and support. And I would just echo that point to say that it's our work to first understand who the survivor is, what's important to them, what's been their lived experience, what concerns do they have about working with us, and really try to engage in transparent dialogue with them to the extent that they're willing to do that. The other thing is that when we talk about accounting for racial bias in our programming and policies, it really means thinking about how resources are made available to survivors and ensuring that it's fair across the board. So one example in our organization would be that we offer toiletries and self-care items across all the programs. But for many years, it wasn't on our consciousness to notice that we weren't offering hair care products for people who are African American. And that's a really good example of the ways that bias can show up in an organization. It wasn't even a thought that we had. And so we really have to think about those things because survivors notice that. And that's how they make decisions about how safe it is to be honest and engage. The other thing that this might mean, so for example, as I said, in our community, we have a good number of immigrants who are in the country, and we're surrounded, by a political climate and laws and policies about immigration status that really impact the sense of safety that a survivor can have in a much broader context. So being fearful of deportation. And how that fear of deportation is, compounds the fear that they might have of the violence that they're experiencing in their home. And so they may feel like they do not know who they can trust, who is required to report them, who's safe to ask, what organizations are safe to access for support services, including law enforcement. So when we think about flexible financial assistance for someone who has that kind of lived experience, often it means that we're using our resources to help them start up a micro business, for example, or thinking about housing as a roommate situation, and making sure that we don't have policies that control who they can live with. Because for many survivors, not just people who are immigrants, having a roommate helps to decrease the expenses that they might have. So this slide is really to speak to eligibility requirements. And I didn't title it that on purpose because it really is about how we center the experience of survivors. So when we think about eligibility for a program, in our agency, it's important to make sure that we aren't implementing practices that make it harder for folks to have access to our programs. And rather than having conversations that look for the reasons that we can't or shouldn't bring someone into the program, we're thinking about the ways that we can and should bring them into the program. And really, that requires us to think about housing as a part of a person's humanity. And so the ways that we engage and have dialogues with them have to go hand in hand with understanding that when someone is homeless, there's a level of desperation that's present for them. Desperation coupled with humiliation and shame oftentimes, that they can't figure it out on their own. So our philosophy around eligibility has to account for that experience and make sure that we aren't setting up an environment where a survivor, where we're having to verify every last thing that they tell us or control the way that they can move in our program and give us feedback. It's about building trust and supporting their decisions without conditions. And as that process plays out over time, it's been our experience that survivors are willing to be more honest about their struggles so that we can support them and they'll see us as a resource for that, rather than them telling us what they think we want to hear in order to get help. And so it's imparting upon them that we believe them and trust that they know the best way through their journey. So an example of this, this happened recently in our program. We had a program participant who we were assisting, we're giving some financial assistance to repair a car that really mattered for their family in terms of being able to transport the children around town, get to and from work, and that sort of thing. And so our staff person was at the location where the vehicle was being fixed and had a check that they were making payment on the account for. And the program participant was unaware that our staff person was going to be there on that day making the payment. And so they happened to arrive as our staff person was there, and they arrived and had gotten a ride from their ex-partner or the person that had been violent to them. And so, you know, in truth, that kind of a scenario would absolutely set off a number of flags and concerns. And there might be, you know, programs that say have rules that say clients can't have interactions with an ex-partner who is abusive in order to receive support. And it might mean in some programs that the person would be exited and unable to continue receiving services for that. And so we have to really check those immediate reactions and give space for the person to have a dialogue with us. So what we did was just that. We started from a place of seeking to understand, inquiring about emotional and physical safety, and also just understanding that this is a person that they share a child with. And prior to being in our program was the only source of support that they had in their life. So in the discussion, we talked about what it meant for the survivor, for that person to be present in their life. And what they communicated was that it was the only time that they had taken that kind of help and really just needed a ride in that moment to get their car. And so then the discussion centered on ongoing safety, and we make choices to believe what survivors are telling us. And understanding that their life is complicated. And we know that even though we might have resources that can help with housing, we don't have resources to address every single need they have every moment of their life. So they're going to continue to make choices about how to survive, and our role isn't to punish them for those choices or judge them for the ways that they're doing that, but just to continue to offer support and think about safety in their interactions. And then also that it's a process to leave a toxic cycle and continue rather than judging, but encourage that person to keep doing their work around triggers and building a support system. And for me and for us, that really is the definition of being trauma-informed. And we've even kind of moved away from using that word, but we like to think about it as seeing the humanity in other people and the ways that they live their life. The other thing that's important for us is to think about our staff. So I think we have an excellent protocol manual with great procedures and policies, but our staff really bring that to life with the folks that they're working with. And I'll tell you that one of our greatest challenges and the reason that we have those vacancies is finding staff that can implement the philosophy in the way we're asking them to. But it really is about our staff understanding that people who need housing and financial assistance, but that immediately puts us in a position of power and authority and sort of gatekeeping of resources and them needing our approval to get their needs met. And so we really need to be mindful of how our staff are moving with the program and making those decisions. And one of the pieces of our model is to make sure that everyone has access to clinicians for guidance and support around how to think about trauma and how it's impacting folks in the program and how they're making decisions. Genese talked a lot about organizational preparation to implement this kind of program. And the thing I wanted to say about this is that it really does require every aspect of the organization to have the same kind of flexibility and understanding that we're asking staff who are working directly with participants to have. So that means that there are times, we have regular days that we cut checks. And our goal is always to make sure that all those requests are in by that day so that it all works smoothly. And there are plenty of times every week that a check needs to be cut in an urgent way. So our finance folks, they are the beautiful human beings who will cut a check the same day or the next day if that's what needs to happen. And they understand that the reasons that people get jammed up with their bills and paying bills have a lot to do with how their trauma has impacted them and how it's integrated. So they might have shame about telling us that they didn't pay a bill and they wait till the last minute. And so rather than punishing them and saying, well, you're going to have the consequence of having your electricity turned off, we're going to use that as an opportunity to notice how their trauma impacts the way they make decisions, and then make a broader connection about what that will mean for them long term in being able to sustain their housing if they continue to operate from that place. And so then what resources and support do they need to begin disrupting that kind of dynamic? This slide is really just sort of a commentary on the idea that this really is about our community's liberation from violence. So in other words, we because we deliver services, we didn't come from an alternate universe where there is no violence and where we were not also impacted by the very things that the folks who are coming to us for help and support have been impacted by. So when we sit in a space where we're, quote, staffing a case or making a decision that greatly impacts someone's life, we think about it from that place. We think about it from the place of, understanding their humanity and understanding that we've all been in spaces in our lives where we were doing things that were what we needed to do to survive, but maybe didn't set us up for the long-term sort of healing and success process that we wanted. And so, again, it's just a piece around how we think about this. So with the last few minutes that I have, I'm going to focus a lot on some of the mechanics of the model. And as I've said, we're ways to make sure people can get into the program versus screening them out. And that is also about having transparent dialogues with the participant about what the barriers are going to be. So if they have a long eviction history or several evictions, if they have a criminal history, those are things that we're going to talk about and partner with them around. This slide should have a lot more circles. I think that there may have been something in the oh, there it goes. I'm in business. So this is really just to, again, invite us to remember that we're nonprofits, programs, and services are embedded in a system of services in an industry. And as a part of that, we're sending people to various places and agencies, and they're asking for help where they're being put through eligibility screenings, interviews that require them to say things in order to get help. They probably have 3, 4, 5 case managers at different agencies. And again, if our goal is to help people find healing, help them to find success in their housing, we have to be really careful about not replicating that dynamic in their life, but truly being a part of their support system and helping them to navigate those systems. In our program, people come into our housing program who are either in shelter or a participant in one of our community-based sites. And so that allows us to do a transition session with the case manager that had been working with them into our housing program. We use critical time intervention model, which is an evidence-based case management model. It was developed in New York State and was really developed for folks who were struggling with mental health issues who needed housing. And what we did was modify it to account for what we know about domestic abuse survivors. We focus on the factors that destabilize housing, not the larger constellation of needs in a person's life. So not everybody who experiences abuse becomes homeless. So what we're looking for in this model is what are the factors in this particular person's life that destabilize their ability to have safe housing. Clinical support is a part of the model, as well as flexible financial assistance. We do our case management out in the community and in their home. And then we give them access to the rest of the support services that we have in the agency. I think that when we talk about these kinds of models, it can be really easy to get fearful about how we would control anything then, right? And how do you have expectations, and what happens if it isn't working out, and how do you address this, that, and the other? And the thing I say is that it's not about not having rules or expectations, but it is about being transparent about how the program works and being honest with people about our limitations. And so there are times that our program doesn't work out for folks. They're not ready to be in the program and really struggle to take the steps that they need. But we just have a conversation with that and then do our best to help them land in the safest way possible if they're not going to stay in our program. The other last thing I want to say is that we've evolved over time. This CTI model is about a 9-month-ish program. We also have transitional housing dollars that let us work with people for up to 2 years. And then the other thing that we'll do is provide financial assistance if that's what is going to be most helpful to people, without insisting that they take intensive case management services to go along with it. So we craft it based on their needs and ensure that we're not making them jump through hoops unnecessarily, and that we're giving them not more than they need, but not less than they need as well. So with that, I'm going to end so that there's time for questions.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you both, Genese and Anna. I could listen to you all day. And we're getting a lot of comments about the thoughtfulness with which you've designed your programs, and I certainly want to echo that. We probably have more questions than we're going to get to, so we'll have to be doing some follow-up with some of you. But in looking over at the ones that have come in, let's just start trying to move through them. One question, and this is one of those mechanics questions, how quickly are you able to turn around the rent check to make the landlords happy?
Well, so as I said, what we try to do is have our case managers know when the rent is due. And that's part of the planning that they'll do with the survivor around making sure that they're accounting for that, and that if they're contributing to the rent, they have their portion of the rent ready. And we try to keep it on a schedule for folks so that we're not bombarding our finance department with check requests at the last minute. But it's really about knowing when it's due and having an internal process that ensures that we get that check out when it's due, so that landlords don't see us as a nuisance or a place they need to chase around for their money, but making sure internally that we're tracking when it's due and getting those checks out is our accountability in the process.
Likewise, as I said, it's our first year, and we are also on the same schedule. So we have our internal process where, just on like clockwork, we have our check request at the end of the month, and it's standard. Our landlords here do not like to accept more than one payment at a time. So we have to give our portion of the rent and the renter's portion of the rent at the same time. So right now, our advocate coordinates all of that.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing how we can not be overwhelmed by all these great questions, but we've had a couple of questions about HMIS and working with COCs and beginning to receive HUD funding. There are some technical answers to that we've been trying to provide in the chat box. Thank you, Christy and Jill, for fielding some of those. and we have some resources that we can send out to you all. I wonder if either of you, Anna or Genese, want to speak to just your experience in developing those relationships with your COC and moving into the funding streams that require HUD compliance. Or is that too big a question for the time we have left?
Well, I can, oh, go ahead, Genese.
I was just going to say really quickly, for me, the foundation was already laid before I started this position. There have been directors, and one is actually on the phone, Amber Batchelor, and a number of directors here at SafeNest had already started the relationship with the COC as, like I said, one of 2 DV providers here in town because we knew that it was a need that needed to be met. And so I was fortunate in that regard that the relationship had already began to foster. So my groundwork was really in just trying to expand it and learning within confidentiality guidelines what best practices were, building a relationship with you, Chris, with Tristy, with Debbie Fox, and just learning what agencies were doing, what survivors were asking for, and just being courageous and as an organization taking that step.
And for us, what it's looked like is we're a member of the COC, but we don't directly send information into HMIS because of the confidentiality piece for survivors. But what we have developed in partnership with the COC is that for survivors who don't mind and are willing, for their information to be entered into HMIS, they're referred to other providers in the community, and they go through the process, and that happens. But if they're not comfortable with that, then we've developed a system where we can give the person an ID number and send the information to the person who manages our HMIS database for the county, and then communication about when housing becomes available through a provider on the continuum happens via our staff, and we get in touch with them. So we're not a part of that. We're not embedded in that system. Our housing program is not, because as a domestic violence agency, we're not required to participate in the same way.
Right. So there are a lot of ropes to learn.
Yes. Do you all have a comparable database? I know we have a comparable database here in Clark County, Nevada.
Yeah, so we're required to collect the same information that HMIS would collect, basically. And it's just in our database.
Yes, likewise. Okay.
And say our TA team can certainly provide more direct information for those of you who have questions about all that and developing a comparable database and so forth. So please do contact us if you want more information than we have the time or ability to get into on this webinar. Here's a question that departs from the technical aspects of working with HUD. Can either of you recommend a good sensitivity or cultural awareness training program?
Well, for us, that's a big question for me to answer because we're, as an organization, going through a process, as I said, of really being critical of ourselves and noticing all the ways that we are not, that there's anti-Blackness present in the organization, where we're not being equitable in processes. And so we've started a lot of really intense internal dialogues and sessions with staff to really think about those things on a personal level for us. And we've partnered with an organization called A Call to Men, which is a national training organization that focuses a lot on the engagement of men in the solution of domestic abuse, but also we're also thinking about our work now is anti-racism work. That domestic abuse work is anti-racism work, is anti-poverty work. And so we're thinking about it in a much broader sort of transformational kind of process for the organization's identity and what the expectations are that we have a staff who come into the organization in terms of their openness to learning those things. Not everyone comes in knowing it and living it, but it's less about trainings, individual trainings, and creating a process for staff to uncover those pieces in their own being, and then notice how that impacts the way they work with survivors.
Great.
That's awesome. And that is so honest. That is so honest, Anna. Here at SafeNest years ago, we used Women of Color Network to start that work that you just mentioned. And so I love the work that they're doing. Also, Move to End Violence has produced some awesome training. And there's also, I believe she is the executive director over in, don't misquote me, I want to say Oregon possibly, Vanessa Timmons. She does some awesome work in terms of oppression and historical oppression and how that relates to cultural competency and anti-violence.
Yeah, thanks for giving a shout out to Oregon, Genese. She is with the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Mm-hmm. So those are just some starting points. Thanks for sharing those.
Yeah, there's some good folks here in the field. I love that we're having these conversations.
Yeah. We did want to return to something that you offered about your program in Las Vegas, Genese, that you mentioned that in order to be eligible through the COC funds, somebody has to come from shelter. And I did want to clarify that I think that's a community level decision that has been made there in your county. But there are definitely jurisdictions where shelter residence is not a requirement to be eligible for that kind of assistance. And in fact, Anna, I think you talked about your program being one of those, that folks can come through other outreach programs that you do and not just have to be residing in your shelter.
Right, that's
so
correct.
we did want to clarify that sounds like a jurisdictional decision rather than a requirement that everyone has to adhere to.
Yes, and we have the limitation in that, Chris, and so with the bonus, we are trying to resolve that.
That's great. Some community level advocacy, yes.
Yes.
We love it. There were some questions about affordable housing and what programs can do in communities with limited affordable housing. I think that's pretty much everywhere. And with landlords unwilling to work with programs. And I know that can be one of the most challenging aspects of launching a rapid rehousing program, is just finding those units. So if either of you have any wisdom to share about how you have develop those relationships, and I know you touched on it some in your presentations, both of you, but any other tips that you have about accessing affordable housing when it's very limited in your community?
I think for us, one of the things that we did was develop and train our staff to think about interacting with landlords as a form of community education. And so we have a whole guide that has various prompts of like, what if the landlord says they're concerned about violence happening on the property? And then it offers them a few talking points that they can use. And then it's also a tool that they use with survivors who, if they're going to advocate on their own, then we help them prepare to answer those questions. The other thing that we have, and Genese kind of talked about this, is that we will offer additional deposit money if the landlord is particularly concerned based on someone's rental history or credit history. And then the other thing that we did was develop a program called LEAP, which is Landlords Eliminating Abuse. And it's a lot about building a network of landlords in the community who are committed to impacting the issue of domestic abuse. And so they sign a partnership agreement that just basically says they care about the issue, they're willing to work with us and partner with us, and because it's mutually beneficial, right? And Genese talked about the piece around money and business. And the thing we say a lot to landlords is, if they're concerned about renting to a survivor, you're renting to them now.
Yeah.
Partnering with us is that we have some financial assistance where we can guarantee rent for you. You have a source of support if there are challenges develop, and we can support you in that process, whereas in those other situations, you don't have that.
Okay,
wow.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you both. We have 1 minute to go, so I just wanted to put out one last question that kind of clusters together a few of the requests. Are either or both of you willing to share information with other interested programs about your policies, your documents, your procedures, any materials that you might have that helped you shape the program or flesh out the program. And Genese in particular, we kind of knew that you might get this question, and you have the Good Tenant guide that you talked about. We're wondering if that's something that you'd be willing to share.
Absolutely.
Okay, so people can contact you both directly. They'll have your contact information if they want those access to those materials?
Yes, yes. Yep. GJON@safenest.org.
All right, and that'll be sent out in our follow-up email. And we are at the end of our time. It just flew by, and I wish we had had more ability to let you all spin out even more knowledge and wisdom. Thank you so much for your time today and really sharing with the listeners what your experience has been in implementing your programs. We're very, very grateful to have had everybody here today, and we'll be following up with an email with an evaluation, the slides, and the contact information for the folks you heard from today. Thank you so much, Genese and Anna, and Christy as well in the background answering a lot of the questions. And we'll be signing off now. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
All right, thanks, everyone.